The Dawn-Breakers, Nabil's narrative, recorded for the handicapped, Tape 7. Chapter 15, Tahiri's journey from Kabila to Khorasan. As the appointed hour approached, when, according to the dispensations of Providence, the veil which still concealed the fundamental verities of the faith was to be rent asunder, there blazed forth in the heart of Khorasan a flame of such consuming intensity that the most formidable obstacle standing in the way of the ultimate recognition of the cause melted away and vanished. That fire caused such a conflagration in the hearts of men that the effects of its quickening power were felt in the most outlying provinces of Persia. It obliterated every trace of the misgivings and doubts which had still lingered in the hearts of the believers, and had hitherto hindered them from apprehending the full measure of its glory. The decree of the enemy had condemned to perpetual isolation him who was the embodiment of the beauty of God, and sought thereby to quench for all time the flame of his love. The hand of omnipotence, however, was busily engaged at a time when the host of evildoers were darkly plotting against him, in confounding their schemes and in nullifying their efforts. In the easternmost province of Persia, the Almighty had, through the hand of Qudus, lit a fire that glowed with the hottest flame in the breasts of the people of Khorasan, and in Kabila, beyond the western confines of that land, he had kindled the light of Tahiri, a light that was destined to shed its radiance upon the whole of Persia. From the east and from the west of that country, the voice of the unseen summoned those twin great lights to hasten to the land of Ta, which is Tehran, the day spring of glory, the home of Baha'u'llah. He bade them each seek the presence and revolve round the person of that day star of truth, to seek his advice, to reinforce his efforts, and to prepare the way for his coming revelation. In pursuance of the divine decree, in the days when Qudus was still residing in Mashhad, there was revealed, from the pen of the Bab, a tablet addressed to all the believers of Persia, in which every loyal adherent of the faith was enjoined to hasten to the land of Ka, the province of Khorasan. A footnote here says, "It is believed," writes Lieutenant Colonel P.M. Sykes, "that the 12th Imam never died, but in AH 260, that is 873, disappeared into miraculous concealment, from which he will appear on the Day of Judgment in the Mosque of Goharshad in Mashhad, to be hailed as the Mihdi or guide, and to fill the earth with justice." From A History of Persia, Volume 2, page 45. The news of this high injunction spread with marvelous rapidity and aroused universal enthusiasm. It reached the ears of Tahiri, who at that time was residing in Kabila, and was bending every effort to extend the scope of the faith she had espoused. She had left her native town of Qazvin, and had arrived after the death of Sir Kazim at that holy city, in eager expectation of witnessing the signs which the departed Seyyid had foretold. In the foregoing pages we have seen how instinctively she had been led to discover the revelation of the Bab, and how spontaneously she had acknowledged its truth. Unwarned and uninvited, she perceived the dawning light of the promised revelation breaking upon the city of Shiraz, and was prompted to pen her message and plead her fidelity to him who was the revealer of that light. The Bab's immediate response to her declaration of faith, which, without attaining his presence, she was moved to make, animated her zeal and vastly increased her courage. She arose to spread abroad his teachings, vehemently denounced the corruption and perversity of her generation, and fearlessly advocated a fundamental revolution in the habits and manners of her people. Her indomitable spirit was quickened by the fire of her love for the Bab, and the glory of her vision was further enhanced by the discovery of the inestimable blessings latent in his revelation. The innate fearlessness and the strength of her character were reinforced 100-fold by her immovable conviction of the ultimate victory of the cause she had embraced, and her boundless energy was revitalized by her recognition of the abiding value of the mission she had risen to champion. All who met her in Kabila were ensnared by her bewitching eloquence and felt the fascination of her words. None could resist her charm. Few could escape the contagion of her belief. All testified to the extraordinary traits of her character, marveled at her amazing personality, and were convinced of the sincerity of her convictions. She was able to win to the cause the revered widow of Sayyid Kazim, who was born in Shiraz, and was the first among the women of Kabila to recognize its truth. I have heard Sheikh Sultan describe her extreme devotion to Tahiri, whom she revered as her spiritual guide and esteemed as her affectionate companion. He was also a fervent admirer of the character of the widow of the Sayyid, to whose gentleness of manner he often paid a glowing tribute. Such was her attachment to Tahiri, Sheikh Sultan was often heard to remark, that she was extremely reluctant to allow that heroine, who was a guest in her house, to absent herself, though it were for an hour, from her presence. So great an attachment on her part did not fail to excite the curiosity and quicken the faith of her women friends, both Persian and Arab, who were constant visitors in her home. In the first year of her acceptance of the message, she suddenly fell ill, and after the lapse of 3 days, as had been the case with Sayyid Kazim, she departed this life. Among the men who in Kabila eagerly embraced, through the efforts of Tahiri, the cause of the Bab, was a certain Sheikh Salih, an Arab resident of that city, who was the first to shed his blood in the path of the faith in Tehran. She was so profuse in her praise of Sheikh Salih that a few suspected him of being equal in rank to Qurus. Sheikh Sultan was also among those who fell under the spell of Tahiri. On his return from Shiraz, he identified himself with the faith, boldly and assiduously promoted its interests, and did his utmost to execute her instructions and wishes. Another admirer was Sheikh Muhammad-i Shibl, the father of Muhammad Mustafa, an Arab native of Baghdad, who ranked high among the ulamas of that city. By the aid of this chosen band of staunch and able supporters, Tahiri was able to fire the imagination and to enlist the allegiance of a considerable number of the Persian and Arab inhabitants of Iraq, most of whom were led by her to join forces with those of their brethren in Persia, who were soon to be called upon to shape by their deeds the destiny and to seal with their lifeblood the triumph of the cause of God. The Bab's appeal, which was originally addressed to his followers in Persia, was soon transmitted to the adherents of his faith in Iraq. Tahiri gloriously responded. Her example was followed immediately by a large number of her faithful admirers, all of whom expressed their readiness to journey forthwith to Khorasan. The ulamas of Kabila sought to dissuade her from undertaking that journey. Perceiving immediately the motive which prompted them to tender her such advice, and aware of their malignant design, she addressed to each of these sophists a lengthy epistle in which she set forth her motives and exposed their dissimulation. A footnote here says, according to Samandar, manuscript page 9, the main reason for the agitation of the people of Kabila which induced them to accuse Tahiri before the governor of Baghdad was a bold action in disregarding the anniversary of the martyrdom of Hussein, which was being commemorated in the early days of the month of Muharram in the house of the late Sayyid Kazim in Kabila, and in celebrating instead the anniversary of the birthday of the Bab, which fell on the first day of that month. She is reported to have asked her sister and relatives to discard their mourning and wear instead gay attire in open defiance of the customs and traditions of the people on that occasion. From Kabila she proceeded to Baghdad. A representative delegation consisting of the ablest leaders among the Shia, the Sunni, the Christian and Jewish communities of that city sought her presence and endeavored to convince her of the folly of her actions. She was able, however, to silence their protestations and astounded them with the force of her argument. Disillusioned and confused, they retired, deeply conscious of their own impotence. The ulamas of Kirmanshah respectfully received her and presented her with various tokens of their esteem and admiration. In Hamadan, however, the ecclesiastical leaders of the city were divided in their attitude towards her. A footnote here says, about Hamadan, they tarried 3 days in the village of Karand, where Tahiri fearlessly proclaimed the teachings of the Bab and was highly successful in awakening the interests of all classes of people in the new revelation. 1,200 persons are reported to have volunteered to follow her and do her bidding. A few sought privily to provoke the people and undermine her prestige. Others were moved to extol openly her virtues and applaud her courage. It behoves us, these friends declared from their pulpits, to follow her noble example and reverently to ask her to unravel for us the mysteries of the Koran and to resolve the intricacies of the Holy Book. For our highest attainments are but a drop compared to the immensity of her knowledge. While in Hamadan, Tahiri was met by those whom her father, Haji Mullah Salih, had sent from Qazvin to welcome and urge her, on his behalf, to visit her native town and prolong her stay in their midst. She reluctantly consented. Ere she departed, she bade those who had accompanied her from Iraq to proceed to their native land. Among them were Sheikh Sultan, Sheikh Mohammed Shibr, and his youthful son, Mohammed Mustafa, Abid, and his son Nazir, who subsequently was given the name of Haji Abbas. Those of her companions who had been living in Persia, such as Syed Mohammed Gulpegani, whose pen name was Ta'ir, and whom Tahiri had styled Fatal Mali, and others, were also bidden to return to their homes. Only 2 of her companions remained with her, Sheikh Saleh and Mullah Ibrahim Gulpegani, both of whom quaffed the cup of martyrdom, the first in Tehran, and the other in Qazvin. Of her own kinsman, Mirza Muhammad Ali, one of the letters of the living and her brother-in-law, and Syed Abdul Hadi, who had been betrothed to her daughter, travelled with her all the way from Karbala to Qazvin. On her arrival at the house of her father, her cousin, the haughty and false-hearted Mullah Muhammad, son of Mullah Taqi, who esteemed himself, next to his father and his uncle, the most accomplished of all the mujtahids of Persia, sent certain ladies of his own household to persuade Tahiri to transfer her residence from her father's house to his own. "Say to my presumptuous and arrogant kinsman," was her bold reply to the messengers, "if your desire had really been to be a faithful mate and companion to me, you would have hastened to meet me in Karbala, and would on foot have guided my howdah all the way to Qazvin. I would, while journeying with you, have aroused you from your sleep of heedlessness, and would have shown you the way of truth. But this was not to be. 3 years have elapsed since our separation. Neither in this world nor in the next can I ever be associated with you. I have cast you out of my life forever." So stern and unyielding a reply roused both Mullah Muhammad and his father to a burst of fury. They immediately pronounced her a heretic and strove day and night to undermine her position and to sully her fame. Tahiri vehemently defended herself and persisted in exposing the depravity of their character. Her father, a peace-loving and fair-minded man, deplored this acrimonious dispute and endeavored to bring about a reconciliation and harmony between them, but failed in his efforts. This state of tension continued until a time when a certain Mullah Abdullah, a native of Shiraz, and fervent admirer of both Sheikh Ahmad and Syed Kazim, arrived in Qazvin at the beginning of the month of Ramadan in the year AH 1263, 13th of August to the 12th of September, AD 1847. Subsequently, in the course of his trial in Tehran, in the presence of the Sahib Divan, this same Mullah Abdullah recounted the following: "I have never been a convinced Bábí. When I arrived in Qazvin, I was on my way to Maku, intending to visit the Bab and investigate the nature of his cause. On the day of my arrival at Qazvin, I became aware that the town was in a great state of turmoil. As I was passing through the marketplace, I saw a crowd of ruffians who had stripped a man of his headdress and shoes, had wound his turban around his neck, and by it were dragging him through the streets. An angry multitude was tormenting him with their threats, their blows and curses. His unpardonable guilt, I was told in answer to my inquiry, is that he has dared to extol in public the virtues of Sheikh Ahmad and Syed Kazim. Accordingly, Haji Mullah Taqi, the Hujjatul Islam, has pronounced him a heretic and decreed his expulsion from the town." I was amazed at the explanation given to me. How could a sheikhi, I thought to myself, be regarded as a heretic? and be deemed worthy of such cruel treatment. Desirous of ascertaining from Mullah Taki himself the truth of this report, I betook myself to his school and asked whether he had actually pronounced such a condemnation against him. Yes, he bluntly replied. The God whom the late Sheikh Ahmad-i Bahraini worshipped is a God in whom I can never believe. Him, as well as his followers, I regard as the very embodiments of error. I was moved that very moment to smite his face in the presence of his assembled disciples. I restrained myself, however, and vowed that, God willing, I would pierce his lips with my spear so that he would never again be able to utter such blasphemy. I straightway left his presence and directed my steps toward the market, where I bought a dagger, a spearhead of the sharpest and finest steel. I concealed them in my bosom, ready to gratify the passion that burned within me. I was waiting for my opportunity when, one night, I entered the masjid in which he was wont to lead the congregation in prayer. I waited until the hour of dawn, at which time I saw an old woman enter the masjid, carrying with her a rug, which she spread over the floor of the mihrab. Soon after I saw Mullah Taki enter alone, walk to the mihrab, and offer his prayer. Cautiously and quietly, I followed him and stood behind him. He was prostrating himself on the floor when I rushed upon him, drew out my spearhead, and plunged it into the back of his neck. He uttered a loud cry. I threw him on his back, and unsheathing my dagger, drove it hilt deep into his mouth. With the same dagger I struck him at several places in his breast and side, and left him bleeding in the mihrab. I ascended immediately the roof of the masjid, and watched the frenzy and agitation of the multitude. The crowd rushed in, and placing him upon a litter, transported him to his house. Unable to identify the murderer, people seized the occasion to gratify their basest instincts. They rushed at one another's throats, violently attacked, and mutually accused one another in the presence of the governor. Finding out that a large number of innocent people had been gravely molested and thrown into prison, I was impelled by the voice of my conscience to confess my act. Accordingly, I besought the presence of the governor and said to him, "If I deliver into your hands the author of this murder, will you promise me to set free all the innocent people who are suffering in his place?" No sooner had I obtained from him the necessary assurance that I confessed to him that I had committed the deed. He was not disposed at first to believe me. At my request, he summoned the old woman who had spread the rug in the mihrab, but refused to be convinced by the evidence which she gave. I was finally conducted to the bedside of Mullah Taki, who was on the point of death. As soon as he saw me, he recognized my features. In his agitation, he pointed with his finger to me, indicating that I had attacked him. He signified his desire that I be taken away from his presence. Shortly after, he expired. I was immediately arrested, was convicted of murder, and thrown into prison. The governor, however, failed to keep his promise and refused to release the prisoners. The candor and sincerity of Mullah Abdullah greatly pleased the Sahib Divan. He gave secret orders to his attendants to enable him to escape from prison. At the hour of midnight, the prisoner took refuge in the home of Riza Khan-i Sardar, who had recently been married to the sister of the Sipa Salah, and remained concealed in that house until the great struggle of Sheikh Tabarsi, when he determined to throw in his lot with the heroic defenders of the fort. He, as well as Riza Khan, who followed him to Mazindaran, quaffed eventually the cup of martyrdom. The circumstances of the murder fanned to fury the wrath of the lawful heirs of Mullah Taki, who now determined to wreak their vengeance upon Tahiri. They succeeded in having her placed in the strictest confinement in the house of her father, and charged those women whom they had selected to watch over her not to allow their captive to leave her room except for the purpose of performing her daily ablutions. They accused her of really being the instigator of the crime. "No one else but you," they asserted, "is guilty of the murder of our father. You issued the order for his assassination." Those whom they had arrested and confined were conducted by them to Tehran, and were incarcerated in the home of one of the Kadkudas of the capital. The friends and heirs of Mullah Taki scattered themselves in all directions, denouncing their captives as the repudiators of the law of Islam, and demanding that they be immediately put to death. Baha'u'llah, who was at this time residing in Tehran, was informed of the plight of these prisoners who had been the companions and supporters of Tahiri. As he was already acquainted with the Kharkhuda in whose home they were incarcerated, he decided to visit them and intervene in their behalf. That avaricious and deceitful official, who was fully aware of the extreme generosity of Baha'u'llah, greatly exaggerated, in the hope of deriving a substantial pecuniary advantage for himself, the misfortune that had befallen the unhappy captives. "They are destitute of the barest necessities of life," urged the Kharkhuda. "They hunger for food, and their clothing is wretchedly scanty." Baha'u'llah extended immediate financial assistance for their relief and urged the Kharkhuda to relax the severity of the rule under which they were confined. The latter consented to relieve a few who were unable to support the oppressive weight of their chains, and for the rest did whatever he could to alleviate the rigor of their confinement. Prompted by greed, he informed his superiors of the situation and emphasized the fact that both food and money were being regularly supplied by Baha'u'llah for those who were imprisoned in his house. These officials were in their turn tempted to derive every possible advantage from the liberality of Baha'u'llah. They summoned him to their presence, protested against his action, and accused him of complicity in the act for which the captives had been condemned. "The Kharkhuda," replied Baha'u'llah, "pleaded their cause before me, and enlarged upon their sufferings and needs. He himself bore witness to their innocence and appealed to me for help. In return for the aid which, in response to his invitation, I was impelled to extend, you now charge me with a crime of which I am innocent." Hoping to intimidate Baha'u'llah by threatening immediate punishment, they refused to allow him to return to his home. The confinement to which he was subjected was the first affliction that befell Baha'u'llah in the path of the cause of God, the first imprisonment he suffered for the sake of his loved ones. He remained in captivity for a few days until Jafar Quli Khan, the brother of Mirza Akbar Khan-i-Nuri, who at a later time was appointed Grand Vizier of the Shah, and a number of other friends intervened in his behalf, and, threatening the Kharkhuda in severe language, were able to effect his release. Those who had been responsible for his confinement had confidently hoped to receive, in return for his deliverance, the sum of 1,000 tumans, but they soon found out that they were forced to comply with the wishes of Jafar Quli Khan, without the hope of receiving either from him or from Baha'u'llah the slightest reward. With profuse apologies, and with the utmost regret, they surrendered their captive into his hands. The heirs of Mullah Taqi were in the meantime bending every effort to avenge the blood of their distinguished kinsman. Unsatisfied with what they had already accomplished, they directed their appeal to Muhammad Shah himself, and endeavored to win his sympathy to their cause. The Shah is reported to have returned this answer: "Your father, Mullah Taqi, surely could not have claimed to be superior to the Imam Ali, the commander of the faithful. Did not the latter instruct his disciples that, should he fall a victim to the sword of Ibn-i-Muljam, the murderer alone should, by his death, be made to atone for his act, and that no one else but he should be put to death? Why should not the murder of your father be similarly avenged? Declare to me his murderer, and I will issue my orders that he be delivered into your hands, in order that you may inflict upon him the punishment which he deserves." The uncompromising attitude of the Shah induced them to abandon the hopes which they had cherished. They declared Sheikh Salih to be the murderer of their father, obtained his arrest, and ignominiously put him to death. Such was the first to shed his blood on Persian soil in the path of the cause of God, the first of that glorious company destined to seal with their life-blood the triumph of God's holy faith. As he was being conducted to the scene of his martyrdom, his face glowed with zeal and joy. He hastened to the foot of the gallows and met his executioner as if he were welcoming a dear and lifelong friend. Words of triumph and hope fell unceasingly from his lips. "I discarded," he cried with exultation as his end approached, "the hopes and the beliefs of men from the moment I recognized thee, thou who art my hope and my belief." His remains were interred in the courtyard of the shrine of the Imam Zadi Zaid in Tehran. The unsatiable hatred that animated those who had been responsible for the martyrdom of Sheikh Saleh impelled them to seek additional instruments for the furtherance of their designs. Haji Mirza Akazi, whom the Sahib Divan had succeeded in convincing of the treacherous conduct of the heirs of Mullah Taqi, refused to entertain their appeal. Undeterred by his refusal, they submitted their case to the Sadr-i Ardibili, a man notoriously presumptuous and one of the most arrogant among the ecclesiastical leaders of Persia. Behold, they pleaded, the indignity that has been inflicted upon those whose supreme function it is to keep guard over the integrity of the law. How can you, who are its chief and illustrious exponent, allow so grave an affront to its dignity to remain unpunished? Are you really incapable of avenging the blood of that slaughtered minister of the Prophet of God? Do you realize that to tolerate such a heinous crime would in itself unloose a flood of calumny against those who are the chief repositories of the teachings and principles of our faith? Will not your silence embolden the enemies of Islam to shatter the structure which your own hands have reared? As a result, will not your own life be endangered? The Sadr-i Ardibili was sore afraid, and in his impotence sought to beguile his sovereign. He addressed the following request to Muhammad Shah: I would humbly implore your majesty to allow the captives to accompany the heirs of that martyred leader on their return to Qazvin, that these may, of their own accord, forgive them publicly their action and enable them to recover their freedom. Such a gesture on their part will considerably enhance their position and will win them the esteem of their countrymen. Shah, wholly unaware of the mischievous designs of that crafty plotter, immediately granted his request, on the express condition that a written statement be sent to him from Qazvin assuring him that the condition of the prisoners after their freedom was entirely satisfactory, and that no harm was likely to befall them in the future. No sooner were the captives delivered into the hands of the mischief-makers than they set about gratifying their feelings of implacable hatred towards them. On the first night after they had been handed over to their enemies, Haji Asadullah, the brother of Haji Alavardi, and paternal uncle of Muhammad Hadi and Muhammad Jabad-i Farhadi, a noted merchant of Qazvin who had acquired a reputation for piety and uprightness which stood as high as that of his illustrious brother, was mercilessly put to death. Knowing full well that in his own native town they would be unable to inflict upon him the punishment they desired, they determined to take his life whilst in Tehran, in a manner that would protect them from the suspicion of murder. At the hour of midnight they perpetrated the shameful act, and the next morning announced that illness had been the cause of his death. His friends and acquaintances, mostly natives of Qazvin, none of whom had been able to detect the crime that had extinguished such a noble life, accorded him a burial that befitted his station. The rest of his companions, among whom were Mullah Tahir-i Shirazi and Mullah Ibrahim-i Mahalati, both of whom were greatly esteemed for their learning and character, were savagely put to death immediately after their arrival at Qazvin. The entire population, which had been sedulously instigated beforehand, clamoured for their immediate execution. A band of shameless scoundrels, armed with knives, swords, spears, and axes, fell upon them, tore them to pieces. They mutilated the bodies with such wanton barbarity that no fragment of their scattered members could be found for burial. Gracious God! Acts of such incredible savagery have been perpetrated in a town like Qazvin, which prides itself on the fact that no less than 100 of the highest ecclesiastical leaders of Islam dwell within its gates. Yet none could be found among all its inhabitants to raise his voice in protest against such revolting murders. No one seemed to question their right to perpetrate such iniquitous and shameless deeds. No one seemed to be aware of the utter incompatibility between such ferocious deeds committed by those who claimed to be the sole repositories of the mysteries of Islam, and the exemplary conduct of those who first manifested its light to the world. No one was moved to exclaim indignantly, "O evil and perverse generation, to what depths of infamy and shame have you sunk? Have not the abominations which you have wrought surpassed in their ruthlessness the acts of the basest of men? Will you not recognize that neither the beasts of the field nor any moving thing on earth has ever equaled the ferociousness of your acts? how long is your heedlessness to last? Is it not your belief that the efficacy of every congregational prayer is dependent upon the integrity of him who leads that prayer? Have you not again and again declared that no such prayer is acceptable in the sight of God until and unless the imam who leads the congregation has purged his heart from every trace of malice? And yet you deem those who instigate and share in the performance of such atrocities to be the true leaders of your faith, the very embodiments of fairness and justice. Have you not committed to their hands the reins of your cause and regarded them as the masters of your destinies? The news of this outrage reached Tehran and spread with bewildering rapidity throughout the city. Haji Mirza Akazi vehemently protested. In what passage of the Quran, he is reported to have exclaimed, in which tradition of Muhammad has the massacre of a number of people been justified in order to avenge the murder of a single person? Muhammad Shah also expressed his strong disapproval of the treacherous conduct of the Sadr-e Ardebili and his confederates. He denounced his cowardice, banished him from the capital, and condemned him to a life of obscurity in Qum. His degradation from office pleased immensely the Grand Vizier, who had hitherto laboured in vain to bring about his downfall, and whom his sudden removal from Tehran relieved of the apprehensions which the extension of his authority had inspired. His own denunciation of the massacre of Qazvin was prompted not so much by his sympathy with the cause of the defenceless victims as by his hope of involving the Sadr-e Ardebili in such embarrassments as would inevitably disgrace him in the eyes of his sovereign. The failure of the Shah and of his government to inflict immediate punishment upon the malefactors encouraged them to seek further means for the gratification of their relentless hatred towards their opponents. They now directed their attention to Tahiri herself, and resolved that she should suffer at their hands the same fate that had befallen her companions. While still in confinement, Tahiri, as soon as she was informed of the designs of her enemies, addressed the following message to Mullah Muhammad, who had succeeded to the position of his father and was now recognized as the Imam Jumi of Qazvin. Fain would they put out God's light with their mouths, but God only desireth to perfect his light, albeit the infidels abhor it. From the Quran 9:33. If my cause be the cause of truth, if the Lord whom I worship be none other than the one true God, he will, ere 9 days have elapsed, delivered me from the yoke of your tyranny. Should he fail to achieve my deliverance, you are free to act as you desire. You will have irrevocably established the falsity of my belief. Mullah Muhammad, recognizing his inability to accept so bold a challenge, chose to ignore entirely her message, and sought by every cunning device to accomplish his purpose. In those days, ere the hour which Tahiri had fixed for her deliverance had struck, Baha'u'llah signified his wish that she should be delivered from her captivity and brought to Tehran. He determined to establish in the eyes of the adversary the truth of her words, and to frustrate the schemes which her enemies had conceived for her death. Muhammad Hadi-e Farhadi was accordingly summoned by him, and was entrusted with the task of effecting her immediate transference to his home in Tehran. Muhammad Hadi was charged to deliver a sealed letter to his wife Khatun Jan, and instruct her to proceed, in the guise of a beggar, to the house where Tahiri was confined, to deliver the letter into her hands, to wait a while at the entrance of her house until she should join her, and then to hasten with her and commit her to his care. As soon as Tahiri has joined you, Baha'u'llah urged the emissary, start immediately for Tehran. This very night I shall dispatch to the neighborhood of the gate of Qazvin an attendant with 3 horses that you will take with you and station at a place that you will appoint outside the walls of Qazvin. You will conduct Tahiri to that spot, will mount the horses, and will, by an unfrequented route, endeavor to reach at daybreak the outskirts of the capital. As soon as the gates are opened, you must enter the city and proceed immediately to my house. You should exercise the utmost caution lest her identity be disclosed. The Almighty will assuredly guide your steps, and will surround you with his unfailing protection. Fortified by the assurance of Baha'u'llah, Muhammad Hadi set out immediately to carry out the instructions he had received. Unhampered by any obstacle, he ably and faithfully acquitted himself of his task, and was able to conduct Tahiri safely at the appointed hour to the home of his master. The sudden and mysterious removal from Qazvin filled her friends and foes alike with consternation. The whole night they searched the houses and were baffled in their efforts to find her. The fulfillment of the prediction she had uttered astounded even the most skeptical among her opponents. A few were made to realize the supernatural character of the faith she had espoused, and submitted willingly to its claims. Mirza Abdul Wahab, her own brother, acknowledged that very day the truth of the revelation, but failed to demonstrate subsequently by his acts the sincerity of his belief. The hour which Tahiri had fixed for her deliverance found her already securely established under the sheltering shadow of Baha'u'llah. She knew full well into whose presence she had been admitted. She was profoundly aware of the sacredness of the hospitality she had been so graciously accorded. And here there is a footnote. Abdul-Baha relates in the Memorials of the Faithful, page 306, the circumstances of a visit paid by Wahid to Tahiri while the latter was staying in the home of Baha'u'llah in Tehran. Tahiri, he writes, was listening from behind the veil to the utterances of Wahid, who was discoursing with fervour and eloquence on the signs and verses that bore witness to the advent of the new manifestation. I was then a child, and was sitting on her lap as she followed the recital of the remarkable testimonies which flowed ceaselessly from the lips of that learned man. I well remember how she suddenly interrupted him, and raising her voice vehemently declared, "O Yahya, let deeds, not words, testify to thy faith. If thou art a man of true learning, cease idly repeating the traditions of the past, for the day of service, of steadfast action is come. Now is the time to show forth the true signs of God, to render asunder the veils of idle fancy, to promote the word of God, and to sacrifice ourselves in his path. Let deeds, not words, be our adorning." As it was with her acceptance of the faith proclaimed by the Bab, when she, unwarned and unsummoned, had hailed his message and recognized its truth, so did she perceive through her own intuitive knowledge the future glory of Baha'u'llah. It was in the year 1260, while in Karbala, that she alluded, in her odes, to the recognition of the truth he was to reveal. I have myself been shown in Tehran, in the home of Syed Muhammad, whom Tahiri had styled Fatal Mahli, the verses which she, in her own handwriting, had penned, every letter of which bore eloquent testimony to her faith in the exalted missions of both the Bab and Baha'u'llah. In that ode the following verse occurs: "The effulgence of the Abha beauty have pierced the veil of night. Behold the souls of his lovers dancing, mote-like in the light that has flashed from his face." It was her steadfast conviction in the unconquerable power of Baha'u'llah that prompted her to utter her prediction with such confidence and to fling her challenge so boldly in the face of her enemies. Nothing short of an immovable faith in the unfailing efficacy of that power could have induced her, in the darkest hours of her captivity, to assert with such courage and assurance the approach of her victory. A few days after Tahiri's arrival in Tehran, Baha'u'llah decided to send her to Khorasan in the company of the believers who were preparing to depart for that province. He too had determined to leave the capital and take the same direction a few days later. He accordingly summoned Ake-i Kalim and instructed him to take immediately the necessary measures to ensure the removal of Tahiri, together with her woman attendant, Khaniti, to a place outside the gate of the capital, from whence they were later on to proceed to Khorasan. He cautioned them to exercise the utmost care and vigilance, lest the guards who were stationed at that entrance of the city, and who had been ordered to refuse the passage of women through the gates without a permit, should discover her identity and prevent her departure. I have heard Ake-i Kalim recount the following: "Putting our trust in God, we rode out, Tahiri, her attendant, and I, to a place in the vicinity of the capital. None of the guards who were stationed at the gate of Shimiran raised the slightest objection, nor did they inquire regarding our destination. At a distance of 2 farsangs from the capital, we alighted in the midst of an orchard abundantly watered and situated at the foot of a mountain, in the centre of which was a house that seemed completely deserted. As I went about in search of the proprietor, I chanced to meet an old man who was watering his plants. In answer to my inquiry, he explained that a dispute had arisen between the owner and his tenants, as a result of which those who occupied the place had deserted it. I have been asked by the owner, he added, to keep guard over this property until the settlement of the dispute. I was greatly delighted with the information he gave me and asked him to share with us our luncheon. When, later in the day, I decided to depart for Tehran, I found him willing to watch over and guard Tahiri and her attendant. As I committed them to his care, I assured him that I would either myself return that evening or send a trusted attendant, whom I would follow the next morning with all the necessary requirements for the journey to Khorasan. Upon my arrival at Tehran, I dispatched Mullah Bakir, one of the Letters of the Living, together with an attendant, to join Tahiri. I informed Baha'u'llah of her safe departure from the capital. He was greatly pleased at the information I gave him, and named that orchard Bagh Jannat, which means the Garden of Paradise. That house, he remarked, has been providentially prepared for your reception, that you may entertain in it the loved ones of God. Tahiri tarried 7 days in that spot, after which she set out, accompanied by Muhammad Hassan-i Qazvini, surnamed Fatah, and a few others in the direction of Khorasan. I was commanded by Baha'u'llah to arrange for her departure and to provide whatever might be required for her journey. Chapter 16. The Conference of Badasht. Soon after Tahiri had started on her journey, Baha'u'llah instructed Arkei Kalim to complete the necessary preparations for his contemplated departure for Khorasan. He committed to his care his family and asked him to provide whatever might be conducive to their well-being and safety. When he arrived at Shahrud, he was met by Qudus, who had left Mashhad, where he had been residing, and had come to welcome him as soon as he had heard of his approach. The whole province of Khorasan was in those days in the throes of a violent agitation. The activities of Qudus and Mullah Hussein had initiated, their zeal, their courage, their outspoken language, had aroused the people from their lethargy, had kindled in the hearts of some the noblest sentiments of faith and devotion, and had provoked in the breasts of others the instincts of passionate fanaticism and malice. A multitude of seekers constantly poured from every direction into Mashhad, eagerly sought the residence of Mullah Hussein, and through him were ushered into the presence of Qudus. Their numbers soon swelled to such proportions as to excite the apprehension of the authorities. The chief constable viewed with concern and dismay the crowds of agitated people who streamed unceasingly into every quarter of that holy city. In his desire to assert his rights, intimidate Mullah Hussein, and induce him to curtail the scope of his activities, he issued orders to arrest immediately the latter's special attendant, whose name was Hassan, and subject him to cruel and shameful treatment. They pierced his nose, passed a cord through the incision, and with this halter led and paraded him through the streets. Mullah Hussein was in the presence of Qudus when the news of this disgraceful affliction that had befallen his servant reached him. Fearing lest this sad intelligence might grieve the heart of his beloved chief, he rose and quietly retired. His companions soon gathered round him, expressed their indignation at this outrageous assault upon so innocent a follower of their faith, and urged him to avenge the insult. Mullah Hussein tried to appease their anger. "Let not," he pleaded, "the indignity that has befallen Hassan afflict and disturb you, for Hussein is still with you and will safely deliver him back into your hands tomorrow."